Hello, everyone. I am Ben Woodbury with the Friends of History. Welcome to the April 2023 presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. These monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History with support from the New Mexico History Museum and from donations from our audience. Today, we are happy to welcome Michael J. Alarid, Assistant Professor, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he is a scholar and teacher of the Latino experience in the Southwest. Michael will discuss his most recent publication, Hispano Bastion, New Mexican Power in the Age of Manifest Destiny, 1837 to 1860. In this groundbreaking study, he examines New Mexico's transition from Spanish to Mexican to U.S. control during the 19th century, and illuminates how distinctly different social and cultural differences between Nuevomexicanos and Euro-Americans shaped the transition of the region during this period. We encourage you, the audience, to ask questions during Michael's talk. Just use the chat box below. We will respond to your queries either during the lecture or as a follow-up after its completion. Thank you for your continued interest in these presentations. Let us now welcome Michael Alarid.
Thanks, Ben. My name is Michael Alarid, as Ben said, and I am a historian over here at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I'm here today to talk to you about my book, Hispano Bastion, New Mexican Power in the Age of Manifest Destiny. The project came about rather organically. And, my initial hope was to write what I thought would be an epic of Hispano resistance to the American incursion. But as I dug further and further, that's simply not the story I found. And so as a result, let's talk about what I did find. As night fell in the dusty Santa Fe streets on Saturday, November 12th, 1853, the plaza was relatively quiet. Families had settled in for the evening, and the working citizens were nestled into their local drinking houses. The spirits flowed, producing a casual merriment among the local townsfolk. And some men risked their salaries in the popular games of the day, including Monte, poker, and faro. The sound of gunfire interrupted the quiet mountain villa and echoed from the Exchange Hotel across the plaza. 2 more shots rang out, and the citizens in the back room of the Exchange Hotel, who were eagerly losing their money at Monte, wrestled the perpetrators to the dusty floor. "We're Texans. We could take this whole town," the prisoners repeated through their drunkenness. On the same floor lay Judge Hugh N. Smith, wounded by a projectile that had passed through his lungs and lodged itself into his shoulder. Somehow, Judge Smith survived, though no one imagined he would, when hours later, a crowd gathered near the plaza and looked on as one of the Texans swayed from a sturdy tree. Men like Judge Hugh N. Smith and Gillian Scallion, the lynched Texan, were victims in a rash of violence that swept through the Southwest in the aftermath of the U.S.-Mexican War. The United States occupied New Mexico and California, and white settlers from the north and south flooded into the Mexican towns of the Southwest. These foreign-born white settlers were determined to make their fortunes, but most of them ultimately failed. In their frustration, they gambled, drank, caroused, fought, and murdered in the streets and bars of towns across the Southwest. Many were soldiers during the war, and most were racist against Nuevomexicanos, Native Americans, Chinese, Latin Americans, free blacks, and anyone who they perceived of as different. They transformed the towns of the Southwest into dangerous places in both New Mexico and California. White Americans carried the banner of manifest destiny into the Southwest, and from every direction, they brought violence with them. As I combed through the archives, I noticed that there was a decided dearth of materials for this period. I'd always wondered why so little had been written about this first initial period in New Mexican history, specifically the post-US Mexican War period. And what I discovered was that the reason so little had been written is that there really wasn't a great deal to work with. I found that there were, business documents. I found, a good deal from the clergy, military records. And the writings themselves that I did find were primarily from the perspective of the large landholding elites. And this is sort of a problem in studying history in general. We find that, it's the voices of everyday people, in this case, our vecinos. Those voices are really silenced within many of these records. But one of the things that William Taylor taught us was that those voices are actually still alive, and they live through the criminal court documents. And so while I was in the archive, I focused primarily on these. I captured them to the best of my ability. I recreated the archive at home, essentially through photocopies. And I utilized Taylor's method of reading these court documents for stories, to be able to tell stories about everyday people that otherwise didn't survive. Making sense of them was another matter. It worked anecdotally, but how could I understand New Mexican society more broadly? And this is where I turned to the work of Randolph Roth and Gary Lafree. Methodologically, I utilized Roth. Roth conducted a study of American homicide into the 1990s. And he sought to do multivariable analysis to try to understand what caused homicide to rise and fall over time. It's an interesting question, one that's been debated widely. A common idea, for example, is that guns will cause homicide to go up, the proliferation of firearms. Turns out that's not actually true. We find that increased firearms tend to be focused within a smaller population. And more importantly, it's the same people buying more and more guns, right? But more importantly, we find that homicide itself just simply doesn't correlate with it. When guns are being proliferated, homicide doesn't follow the trend there. Some, guns going up, but homicide moves more like this, up and down. Another idea that we commonly hear is the notion that poverty is what causes homicide. But if that were true, the most homicidal time in our history would no doubt be the Great Depression. And it's actually one of the more peaceful times in American history. People instead come together. And so what Roth found was that there was, in fact, there were a few things that correlated. And the most important of which, for our purposes, is how people feel about their local government. Whether or not they feel that their local officials are able to find redress when they have complaints, are able to be responsive to their needs, protect them from anything that might be illegal or untoward. When people feel comfortable, when they feel secure, they're peaceful. And when people don't, well, they take the law into their own hands. And Roth certainly proved a correlation between those things with his work. And Lafree had talked about this himself. He had used the term legitimacy. And he said that, he wrote that the idea of legitimacy is central, and that when people feel the government's legitimate, when they feel that they're protected by legitimate entities, that when they feel the police, for example, are legitimate, that it's in those times that people are less violent. They're more likely to, contact someone else and seek redress through nonviolent means. That's a really interesting way to look at this, and it's what I turn to try to understand violence and homicide in New Mexico. And so what I did is I created large spreadsheets, and then I graphed it, and I measured homicide rates over time. And I found moments when homicide was flat and moments when it rose. And that's what this book deals with. It follows that line. It acts as the infrastructure, or as the structure itself, I should say. Think of a skyscraper, and you have certainly the walls are important, the windows are important, but it's that structure, that internal structure, that's what holds the project up. That's what prevents it from being just a pile of rubble and collapsing. And that's what I did. I used that line of Homicide, but that wasn't the only one I did. I decided to do the same thing with larceny, which, to my knowledge, I'm the only person to do that so far. But I measured larceny as well, larceny rates over time. I measured assault rates over time, and using all of these various metrics that, combined with doing a quantitative analysis of the senses, it really built a picture. A new story started to emerge. One where, in fact, when the flag changed colors, Nuevomexicanos felt very comfortable. The homicide rate, as you'll see, doesn't increase right away. It takes time. And it's through these methods that I was able to uncover that particular story. My book itself, it's simultaneously chronological and thematic. Of course, there's the introduction, which you can read on your own at some point, hopefully. The first chapter deals with the rise of the patrónes and the burden of the vecinos. And as this power structure emerged in the Mexican period, as I started to get a clearer view of it, it became clear that how I previously conceived of the Mexican period was a bit flawed. And so I utilized numbers to try to understand that as well. Ultimately, what emerges is the rise of these patrones, these, quite typically Mexican strongmen, to use the direct translation of caudillo. And when you see, their behavior, when you put it in context, and when you see what's happening in Greater Mexico, one of the things you have to remember is that in the Mexican period, New Mexico's part of Mexico, and it's not surprising that it follows trends that the rest of the northern areas, northern settlements follow as well. The 1837 rebellion isn't isolated. It's part of a wide string of rebellions across the northern borderlands. New Mexico is no different. It's very much a typical Mexican location. That led me into the study of larceny and the process of territorialization, which we'll look at real quick. Here we see the Mexican population after the US-Mexican War. And on top of that, the Santa Fe County population as it changed from 1850 to 1860. And there are some surprising things in these numbers. First of all, it's important to note that within the wider borderlands, American borderlands, one of the things we find is that there is a great deal of Nuevomexicanos and not so many Mexicanos in the other regions. This is where the population was. One of the reasons why New Mexico holds up so well over time is its demographics. There was a substantial population there, and these were these were governed by large landholders with horses, with guns, with men, and they knew how to fight. They had a long history of fighting. Whereas when you look at a place like Arizona or California or even Texas, the numbers are quite small comparatively. On top of that, when you look at what happened in New Mexico from 1850 to 1860, a lot of it's a very interesting trend, right? You see that it's 87% Hispano in 1850, but that number surprisingly increases. Now, it doesn't increase because there's a great deal of immigration of any sort. In fact, what we know is that people are leaving Santa Fe in pretty large numbers by 1860. However, there's so many children being born in this period that it more than replaces the population. On top of that, the Americans, the Anglo-European population, is moving on. They're not doing well there. Financially, they're basically failing. It's only the whites who were there before the land changed hands. Those are the ones that were successful because they were partnered with the local Nuevomexicanos, with these local patrones. So they work together, in fact. And it's kind of one of the surprising things that comes out of this is that you'll see that there was very much cooperation. Controlling New Mexico required pacifying these large landholders because there were so many of them, because they were so skilled and so well armed. It wasn't a situation where you could just show up and push them off their land. You had to deal with this. The term I use is Hispano Bastion. It's still, when you look at the modern day census, look at the map, it's the same space is carved out. The population endures, and it really finds its roots in this early period. And as to the Native American population, it essentially vanishes within this county, to be very clear, not New Mexico more broadly. Now here we see Santa Fe County property distribution over time, 1850 and 1860. And one of the things you'll notice right away is in 1850, Nuevomexicanos control 36% of the property. They have surprisingly lost a good deal of their property, and very quickly. And that's because the Americans seem to be at work claiming public lands. That's a big part of this, and that becomes listed as property. But even still, they're able to claim a great deal of property at the initial onset. You can see that 6% belong to Anglo-European property holders, and 56% will belong to Anglo-American property holders. And this is really concentrated in the hands of very few people. By 1860, their property percentage has declined precipitously. Mexican-born property has declined. Anglo-Europeans are doing well. They have improved their stead. But if you look at the New Mexican property, they've managed to capture what's been left by the Anglo-American property holders. So they're doing quite well financially. But when you zoom in and take a closer look at what's happening within this New Mexican society, what starts to emerge is a very stratified society, one that's dominated by, again, these patrones. In 1790, you can see that 85% of Nuevomexicanos were farmers. But when you look, even though the number continues to rise and more land continues to be cultivated, perfectly reasonable, what you find is that the percentage who are doing that job is on the decline. Craftsmen and artisans, they climb somewhat, but what you're really seeing is an increase in laborers and servants. Laborers and servants. That's what's happening, is this society is becoming one that is very much a class-based structure. And this is going to have a great impact on everyday lives. You go from having a place where people are essentially self-sustaining to one where they're creating excess goods. And this is part of the Santa Fe Trail. The ability to trade is a major factor here. By 1850, they're able to trade quite significantly. Well, the more you need to produce, the more laborers you need to find. And a lot of these smaller farmers, their children aren't able to follow their parents in their footsteps. They end up in, that labor class. And it really does change the structure of the society. Now that kind of sets the tone for what happens in chapter 3, which is entitled Between a Rock and a Gun, Vecino and White Homicide. And in this chapter, primarily my focus is on this early period from 1847 to 1853. It's truncated because the data are truncated. Homicide is, in fact, quite neutral in this period. And here's a table that really shows that. Between 1838 and 1845, the homicide rate is only 23 per 100,000. By 1847 and 1850, it goes to 29 per 100,000, very insignificant in the change. And between 1851 and 53, it's 23 per 100,000. It's very flat. But we know that the Southwest, and we know that New Mexico and these other regions are known for violence. So who's committing the violence? Well, as it turns out, it's the incoming settlers. It's these, what have been termed adventurers by some scholars, who come into the region and who essentially commit homicide at higher rates. This to give you an idea of how high 162 per 100,000 is, the United States of America has the highest rate of any Western country for homicide. We oscillate between 5 and 10 per 100,000. Comparatively, Canada is second at like 1.2 per 100,000, and most of the European nations are well below 1. 162 per 100,000 is representative of a colonization. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the colonization of New Mexico in numeric form. You can see it's pretty steady, 162, 173. These are extremely high homicide rates. To put that in perspective, when we look at homicide rates per person for the entire region, right, and we combine white and Nuevo-Mexicano homicide, it actually does fit with what we see in other parts of the Southwest, particularly California, where there's so many people incoming. In the regions where Californios are the majority and they're doing quite well and they're able to sustain themselves, the homicide rate is actually relatively similar. It's below 100. It's 61 is the highest in San Joaquin. What we're looking at essentially is that when you have a large population and you have people who can protect themselves and defend themselves, they seem to trust their local officials quite a bit more than when you have people who are in the midst of being displaced. And that's really the key. And the key to this whole thing is that, when people find themselves in a position where they can no longer rely on the government, it really does change their behavioral patterns. The reverse is true. Let's take a look at California versus New Mexico homicide rates by ethnicity. And what you can see here is that Californios are killing at the rate of 161 per 100,000 compared to Santa Fe, where it's 23. Non-Mexicano whites, can you see that? 53 per 100,000 versus 166. They're inverted, right? California is being swarmed by American settlers, by European settlers, and they're there to take. And the governments that are being set up protect the Californians, the new white Californians. Californios are not protected. And so what do? Well, they do what people do when they don't trust the government, when they don't trust the local officials. They take the law into their own hands. And that's what you see here. But New Mexico isn't static. And the relations between these large landholders and the everyday people, they do change over time. And by 1856, things have really come to a head. So what happens? It's really sort of a central question within the book. What happens that suddenly we see a climb from homicide rates that are really quite low to ones that are in excess of 300 per 100,000? It's a massive shift that we witness here. And it's a spike that lasts from 1856 to 57. That's relatively when you see the homicide. But you see assault following very much the same pattern. Assault starts just a little bit earlier, around 1854, the assault pattern starts to kick up. And by 1856 and 57, it's at its height. You see many things. To try to understand it and to try to smooth the experience, I followed kind of in the footsteps of Gary Lafree, in that I combined two different things to create a violent crime rate. I combined homicide and assault. Now, I didn't include rape, and it's a violent crime, but people just didn't report it. in this time period. We know it happens. We know for sure it happens, but there's only one record of a rape being reported in New Mexico in this period. And it's in the very initial days of the American invasion. And so when we combine them, a steadier picture starts to emerge. And you can see here that homicide is just kind of sliding, or a violent crime is just sliding up ever so slightly among Hispanos. And then it precipitously drops here. And this is that 1857 year right there. That's 1857. That's when things really change. And from studying the census, I can tell you what it is, that there was an exodus. People decided to leave. And it's tied in with so many different factors, which unfortunately I won't have time to go into today. But it's tied in with, the economy, with who's benefiting, who's profiting, and as you'll see, in particular with income inequality. So here we see Hispano versus white violent crime rates. And of course, as we talked about, violent crime includes assault and homicide. It's noteworthy that it doesn't include rape. And the reason it doesn't include rape is that people just simply didn't report it in this time period. There's only one case that was reported to the authorities. There are no other instances. Of course, we know it happens and it's violent, but the data are simply insignificant. So we've left them out in this violent crime rate. And you can see over time that the violent crime rate, even though Nuevomexicanos are committing violent crime at a significantly higher rate than ever before, it still never measures up to the crime rates that you see committed by these incoming settlers. And it makes sense. When you go somewhere and you're, especially if you're we know that homicide and violence, primarily the work of young males, young men, and especially if they're away from home. When they're away from home, they don't have accountability, they don't have connections to the community. And so when things go wrong, they tend to lash out. They tend not to feel like they can appeal to anyone because they don't have those traditional forces. What's holding Nuevo Mexicano violent crime down all these early years, from here to here, is their connection both to the large landholders and to the clergy. When that breaks, that's when you start to see things change. And here we see Hispano versus white homicide rates and assault rates. We kind of pull them back apart. We've seen them combined in the form of violent crime. Now let's take them apart and take a look at what's happening within these two crimes. And what you see here is that big spike in homicide that happens in 1856. And you could see something's happening in New Mexican society. It's not just among Hispanos. Something else is going on that's causing this homicide rate to drive up at almost the same exact rate. You see the angle? Very similar trends. But then in 1856, homicide rates just keep climbing. I mean, this is a war zone. And you get to 652 per 100,000, that's essentially the behavior in a war zone. And then you see down here, the steep decline. And, from my findings, I would postulate that what you're seeing when it drops to 75 per 100,000 is that, Nuevo Mexicanos are simply leaving. They're giving up on this region. And you can see the assault rates are very similar in the way that they transpire too. So we know there's a connection between homicide and assault, which means that, in fact, our usage of the term violent crime is really good. And this is where things get even more interesting. What you're seeing here is homicide rates as they occur throughout the Southwest in this time period. And you can see that Monterey County is, between 55 and 57 is more homicidal than any other region at 609 per 100,000. But take a look down here, 1855 to 60 at the very bottom, there's New Mexico, there's Santa Fe County at 165 per 100,000, almost identical to what you see in Gila County, Arizona between 1880 and 1890. This is an extremely violent region in this time period. And it's a story that, is sort of quantitatively unexpected. we don't think of New Mexico, or so Santa Fe County in particular, as having this much strain on the population. But I think that that's in large part due to several things. One, there's what's happening within the Nuevo Mexicano community. And by 1855, 56, Nuevo Mexicanos are starting to recognize that the people they thought they could count on, that they could appeal to for justice, they're no longer listening. Increasingly, you see within the territorial laws passage of more draconian punishments. You also see a good deal of increase in the number of lashes for larceny. And many of the appeals to the federal government being written by the territorial legislature, they center on putting the onus on the American government to take care of everyday people, which tells us that less and less they're doing so themselves. And that breaking of the bond between vecino and patrones, I think that that's really important here, not to be underestimated. Meanwhile, in terms of the incoming settlers, I think we're seeing a rise and increase of more Texans and more Southerners coming in with the intention of pushing their message and ultimately taking the territory. I think that impacts this homicide rate. And you put these two things together, and this becomes the second most homicidal region in the borderlands. Again, we have to follow the numbers to really understand why that happened. And here's a couple graphs to close, which I think, really give us some insight into what everyday people were dealing with. The distribution of wealth in Santa Fe County in 1860 for males over 15, the top 1% owned 47% of that property and wealth. When you look at those same data, distribution of total known wealth, males over 15 in Santa Fe County, and you just look at the top 10%, right? What you're seeing is a very top-heavy New Mexican society. It's divided. It's divided by class. The numbers are really clear on this point. And so we take all these numbers together. We take all these data points. And that's what comprises the structure of New Mexican history in this time period. What I've done is I've taken homicide, assault, larceny, land distribution, wealth distribution, demographic change. That's what is the heart of this study. And then I did the work of grafting on all of the different stories that I'd read and that many of you have read as we've gone through the historiography of New Mexico. And for me, those stories made a lot more sense within the context of this, of what the data tell us. To me, it was important to try to build that, that outside structure, and then try to reckon with how it's impacted the lives of everyday Nuevo Mexicanos, and of course, the ruling class as well. And what I found is that I think, like most colonial situations, the key to American success in New Mexico was the willingness of local landholders, in this case patrones, their willingness to cooperate, and their belief that they could prosper through the new government. And ultimately, it led to a real disintegration of that old bond that had existed, that had kept New Mexico peaceful, or kept Santa Fe County peaceful for so long. That erodes, and New Mexicans lose their faith in the patrones, and they take the law into their own hands.
Thank you, Michael. What a most interesting presentation. And I really commend the way you've been able to take statistical data and make it live. It means a lot, I think, in terms of understanding, which, as you pointed out, is a most generally a period that hasn't been studied and for which there isn't much information other than than some analytical material, which certainly enriches the story. But you've given us an opportunity to have a better understanding of the underlying trends which were occurring, and of the reflection of the tensions that are there through the transitions from Mexican to a U.S. territorial experience. So I was curious, though, where did you find the data, and what were your most useful archives and other sources?
Yeah, everything is housed within the New Mexico State Record Center and Archive.
Okay.
They have done an outstanding job of collecting all of the court records, and they house them there for all the different counties. In fact, my next book, I'm going back there to do Doña Ana. That'll be the next one I do.
Wonderful. We look forward to the insights that you will derive as you've successfully done with Hispano Bastion. So thank you again. For our audience, should you have any additional questions, feel free to use the chat down below for this YouTube site, or write to us at nmhmfriendsofhistory@gmail.com, and we will be sure to share them with Michael. In closing, a reminder to all to check out the Friends of History webpage, where you can again watch this lecture, as well as other First Wednesday lectures covering a wide range of historical topics in New Mexico. As well, come back to the webpage to learn about our upcoming 2023 topics for our First Wednesday lecture series, and more broadly about the Friends of History itself. Finally, consider making a donation, however small, so that we can continue to provide these informative lectures to you throughout the year. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much.